great illustrations really help a sermon come alive. So let's think about how to use illustrations and how to avoid abusing them in order to maximize the impact of your message when you communicate God's truth. First of all, what constitutes an illustration? Well, an illustration can be a story, it can be some current event, it can be drawn from popular culture, it can be an analogy, it could be something that you've learned in some way that illuminates biblical truth. It casts light on the truth. Personal stories are great. Stories from your own experience or the experience of someone that you know or from your family, those are really, really great. But it can also be stories from things that you've read, stories from the past in history. It can be stories from current events, like I said, or popular culture. It doesn't have to be just a story. It could be an analogy. If you learn something about how things work, then that can be an analogy of maybe a spiritual truth. All of those different things can illustrate and illuminate God's truth. So think with me about the purpose of illustrations in a message. And again, in general, the purpose is to illuminate the truth. But as you work out the message, there's a number of specific purposes beyond that. Number one, an illustration can help you establish rapport with your audience. Especially if you open the introduction with an interesting story or an experience that you've had, it helps to draw them into you, to get to know you a little bit, and to engage them. An illustration also has the power to stir the emotions. There's times in the message where that's appropriate. It helps people to remember the things that you're talking about. A story will grab the memory a lot more powerfully than just a statement of truth. And illustrations are really important to help keep your audience engaged. You know, about every 5 minutes, people are going to start wandering away, and a great story, a great illustration can help bring them back and engage them again. But when it comes to the actual content of the things you want to share, illustrations have 3 important purposes. Number one is they help you to explain the truth. As you tell a story or share an illustration, it has the effect of people saying, "Oh, I get it. That's really true. That makes sense what he's saying." And then secondly, a great illustration has the power to prove the truth to people, to prove the truth of what you're saying. And again, there's an aha moment. As you tell a story, people go, "Oh, that's right, that's true." And then thirdly, illustrations help you to apply the truth in people's lives. You can tell a story or an illustration that helps people understand what it looks like to put that principle into practice in their daily lives. Now think with me about some pitfalls to avoid, some abuses of illustrations to avoid. First of all, the first abuse is don't settle for a dry, boring sermon. In other words, use illustrations. Take the time to think them through. Sometimes it takes creativity. Sometimes it takes mental work to think how to illustrate. And a lot of us, if you're wired a certain way, you'll want to do all your study and you're thinking about the outline and the content and the things you want to share, and you'll run out of time and you'll shortcut the illustrations. Don't make that mistake. Again, people need to be engaged. People need to have these things illustrated and demonstrated to them. And so make sure that good illustrations are interspersed throughout your message, from the introduction to the conclusion and the main points throughout. So number one, don't settle for a dry, boring sermon. Number two is don't use an illustration that doesn't have a point. If it's not relevant to what your big idea is, to what you're trying to communicate in that point, don't use it. You might have a great experience that recently happened to you, you want to share it, or you might have a great joke that you've heard recently, but if it's not germane, if it doesn't have a focus point, don't use it. Set it aside, write it down, store it somewhere in a file or something. You can use it later, but don't use it unless it's right on target. And then third, as you tell stories about other people, make sure that you never violate confidentiality. Get permission from your family before you share stories about them, depending on the age that your kids are, of course. And don't use counseling as a source of illustrations. If people feel like that their private conversations with you in counseling are going to end up as a sermon illustration some way, that will minimize their trust in you. So don't be careful about confidentiality. And then fourthly, make sure that you're always telling the truth. Don't deceive people. If people have to wonder if you're telling the truth, they're not going to listen to you. So make sure when you tell a story that you get the facts straight, that you tell it accurately, and never ever tell a story as if it was about you that happened to somebody else. And then never make yourself the hero. It's easy to tell a story where you are the hero, but people don't relate to that. That doesn't help people. It draws attention to us instead of Christ, and it doesn't help people who are struggling with real issues in life to feel like they could succeed. And then finally, don't confuse people with illustrations. Part of that is don't tell an obscure story. If you have to explain and do a big major setup in order to tell the story for the illustration to make sense, then it's too obscure, it's too complicated, it's going to lose its impact. And then don't confuse people with too many stories. It's easy to put too many illustrations into a message that don't all go the same direction, that maybe there's just bits and pieces of different things. You can tell too many stories if they're not all coherent, if they don't pull together. And then also don't confuse people with illustrations that aren't relevant, that they're not relatable. I can tell stories about some obscure thing that happened in my life or some obscure thing from history, but if it's so unrelatable to the average person in your audience, then it's not going to really have its impact. And so I want to encourage you to think hard about the illustrations that you use. Spend the time, do the work to choose great stories and to tell them well, and you're going to have a lot more impact in the times you have opportunity to share God's truth.